In the midst of life's trials, when the weight of the world feels unbearable, there is a truth that stands firm. You do not fight alone. Too often we become overwhelmed by our struggles, burdened by the challenges that seem insurmountable. But we must remember, in every battle you face, there is a divine hand at work. And that hand is not yours to bear, it is God's. Think of the Israelites standing at the edge of the Red Sea. Before them, an impassable water. Behind them, the chariots of Pharaoh closing in. It seemed like the end. Yet, in that moment, God spoke to Moses, telling him, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." In that stillness, in that moment of surrender, the waters parted and they walked through on dry ground. When life feels overwhelming, when the battles seem relentless, it is easy to believe that we are fighting alone. We tend to feel the weight of the world on our shoulders and find ourselves struggling to maintain control over every situation. But the truth that often eludes us is that God fights for you. The struggles you face, no matter how difficult or insurmountable they seem, are not yours alone to bear. God has promised that He is with you every step of the way, and He will never leave you to fight by yourself. Take a moment to reflect on the stories from Scripture, where God's presence was the ultimate force that turned the tide of battle. One of the clearest examples of this is found in the story of the Israelites as they faced the seemingly impossible situation at the Red Sea. With Pharaoh's army closing in and no escape in sight, they were trapped between the sea and their enemies. It seemed like the end was near, but God spoke to Moses, saying, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." In that moment, the Israelites were instructed to do nothing but trust that God would act, and act He did. The waters of the Red Sea parted, and the Israelites walked through on dry land with Pharaoh's army defeated. This powerful act of divine intervention teaches us a crucial truth. God fights our battles. It is not our own strength, cleverness, or strategy that determines the outcome, but God's sovereign power. He alone has the ability to make the impossible possible. His plan is always greater than our understanding, and His hand is always at work, even when we cannot see it. When we face trials, we often look at our own limited resources and feel inadequate. We compare our weaknesses to the magnitude of the challenge and wonder how we can possibly overcome it. But the moment we realize that it is not our own strength that will win the victory is the moment we can begin to rest in God's promises. The victory is already secured, not because of anything we can do, but because God has already gone ahead of us, and He has equipped us with everything we need to walk in His victory. Consider the many battles we face today. The struggles in our relationships, the battles in our workplaces, the financial pressures and the personal battles within our hearts. It's easy to think that we have to fight them all on our own, but this is not what God has called us to. When we feel burdened, when we feel like the odds are stacked against us, it is essential to remember that God is fighting on our behalf. His presence is more than enough to ensure that we overcome. The concept of God fighting our battles is not just a past promise. It is a present reality. Jesus Himself spoke of the strength and authority that God has over every circumstance. In the Gospels, He often rebuked the disciples for their fear and lack of faith, reminding them that God's power was greater than any situation they faced. And He continues to offer us that same reassurance today. Whether the storm is raging around us or the path is unclear, God is not absent. He is right there, at work in ways we cannot always see or comprehend. But His power is always at work, orchestrating the victory. One of the most profound ways that God fights for us is through His promises. In moments of difficulty, we can turn to His Word and find comfort and strength. The Bible is full of promises that speak directly to our struggles. Promises of peace, promises of deliverance, promises of hope. Each promise is a weapon in our spiritual arsenal, a reminder that God's power is greater than anything we could ever face. In moments when we feel overwhelmed, these promises become the foundation upon which we stand. Even in the darkest of times, when everything seems to be crumbling around us, we must hold fast to the truth that God is with us. It's easy to forget that God's ways are not our ways. When we look at the struggles from our human perspective, we may feel like the battle is lost. But from God's perspective, He sees the whole picture. He sees the end from the beginning. He knows what is coming and is already at work in ways we may not understand. Trusting that God is fighting for us means surrendering our need for control and embracing His perfect plan. God's presence in the battle is a reminder that He is our protector, our shield, and our deliverer. His fight is not against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual forces that seek to destroy us. And in Him we are more than conquerors. So when life struggles arise, remember that God fights for you. You are not alone. Your fight is not yours to fight alone. God has already claimed the victory, and all you are called to do is trust in His unfailing strength. When life becomes overwhelming, our instinct is often to fight back, to strive, to exert all our energy and willpower in an attempt to take control of the situation. It is a natural human response to the challenges we face. We tend to think that in order to overcome the battles in our lives, we need to rely on our own strength, plans, and strategies. But this is not the way God calls us to face our struggles. Instead of striving, God invites us to surrender. He calls us to trust in Him completely, knowing that the outcome is in His hands, not ours. To surrender doesn't mean to give up. It means to let go of our need to control. When we surrender to God, we acknowledge that His ways are higher than ours, and His understanding far exceeds our own. We are not surrendering to a life of passivity or defeat, but to a life where we place our trust in the one who holds the universe in His hands. This is the profound invitation God gives us to stop striving and to begin trusting. The fight is not ours to win, but His. First, this idea of surrender is illustrated clearly in the story of the Israelites and their deliverance from Egypt. When they were trapped at the edge of the Red Sea with Pharaoh's army pursuing them, the Israelites were terrified. They were surrounded by seemingly impossible circumstances with no way out. In this moment of fear and uncertainty, God spoke to Moses, telling him to instruct the people to stand firm and be still. The Lord would fight for them. All they had to do was trust and wait. As the Israelites stood on the banks of the sea, they were called to let go of their fear and their attempts to find their own escape. It was in their surrender, their willingness to trust in God's plan, that the waters parted and their deliverance came. Surrendering to God's plan can be one of the hardest things we do because it requires letting go of our own plans, desires, and timelines. We often feel like we need to act, to make things happen on our own. But God calls us to a different way. He calls us to a place of stillness where we stop trying to force outcomes and start trusting that He is already at work behind the scenes. This is not a call to idleness, but to a deeper faith. It is a call to trust that the God who holds the universe in His hands is also holding your life, and He knows what is best for you. In moments of difficulty, the temptation is to worry, to obsess over the problem, and to try to fix everything ourselves. But in doing so, we often make the situation worse, not better. Our efforts to control can lead to more anxiety, more frustration, and less peace. But when we surrender to God, we let go of that burden. We place the situation in His hands, trusting that He will provide a way even when we can't see it. Surrendering to God doesn't mean that we sit back passively and do nothing. It means that we cease relying on our own wisdom and strength and begin to seek His. It means we take steps in faith, trusting that He will guide us every step of the way. This doesn't mean that life will always go according to our plans or that every struggle will be easy. In fact, surrendering to God often requires us to go through difficult and uncomfortable situations. But it is in these moments that we experience the depth of God's power. We learn that it is not our efforts, but His grace that sustains us. The Apostle Paul spoke about this when he wrote about his own struggles. He said that he had learned to find contentment not in his strength, but in his weakness. Because in his weakness, God's power was made. When we surrender, we open the door for God's strength to flow into our lives, enabling us to endure and overcome in ways that we never could on our own. To surrender is not an act of resignation, it is an act of faith. It is choosing to believe that God is greater than our fears, greater than our struggles, and greater than our limitations. It is the recognition that we do not have to carry the burden of life's battles by ourselves. When we surrender to God, we are acknowledging that He is in control, that He has a plan for our lives, and that His plans are always for our good. Even when we can't see how things will work out, we can trust that He is working on our behalf. In surrendering to God, we find peace. We find rest for our weary souls. Instead of constantly striving, we begin to live in the confidence that the Creator of the universe is fighting for us. His power is greater than anything we can face, and His love for us is unshakable. When we choose to surrender, we allow God to take the lead, to show us the way, and to fight the battles we cannot win on our own. So when life becomes overwhelming and the temptation to fight on your own rises, remember that God calls you to surrender. Let go of the need to control and trust that His plan is far greater than anything you could ever devise. Surrender to Him and watch as He works on your behalf in ways you could never imagine. The concept of God's perfect timing is one that often challenges us, especially when we find ourselves in the midst of trials and difficulties. We want things to happen on our terms, in our time. We want answers to our prayers immediately, resolutions to our problems as soon as possible, and relief from our struggles right now. But God's timing is not like ours. His ways are not our ways, and His understanding of what we need and when we need it far exceeds our own. This is a truth that we must learn to embrace. God's timing is always perfect, and His timing is always best. Consider the story of Abraham and Sarah. God had promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations. Yet, as the years passed and no child was born, Abraham began to doubt the promise. Sarah, too, became impatient, and they tried to take matters into their own hands. Instead of waiting on God's timing, they made a decision to have a child through Hagar, Sarah's servant, believing that it was the only way to fulfill God's promise. However, this decision led to complications and conflict. It was only when Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah was well beyond childbearing age that God fulfilled His promise, giving them a son, Isaac. If they had rushed ahead of God's timing, they would have missed the miracle of God's perfect provision. This story shows us that even when God has given us a promise, it may take longer than we expect for that promise to come to pass. The waiting period can be frustrating, and we may question why things aren't happening the way we envisioned them. But in these moments, God is teaching us patience, trust, and dependence on Him. He knows exactly when the right time is. And when that time comes, His provision will be more than we could have hoped for. Another example of God's perfect timing is seen in the life of Joseph. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, wrongfully accused of a crime, and thrown into prison. For years he endured hardship and suffering, yet he remained faithful to God. At any point, Joseph could have given up, lost faith, or questioned why God allowed him to go through such difficulties. But at the right moment, God orchestrated events that elevated Joseph from prison to the palace. Joseph was placed in a position of power second only to Pharaoh, and in that moment, he was able to fulfill God's purpose for his life, saving his family from famine and bringing about the greater good. Joseph's story reveals an important lesson. Even though the path may seem long and filled with suffering, God is never absent. His timing is not a delay, but a preparation. Everything Joseph went through was leading to the moment when his rise to power would save nations. What appeared to be a detour was actually a divine setup for something greater. In the same way, when we are in seasons of waiting, it is not because God is indifferent to our struggles or desires. It is because He is preparing us for what is to come. In our own lives, we often find ourselves in situations where we desperately want things to change. We long for breakthrough, healing, or deliverance, and we wonder why it is taking so long. But God's timing is never arbitrary. Every step of the journey is part of His plan to shape and refine us. The waiting period is not wasted time. It is a time of preparation. During these times, God is working in ways that we may not see, aligning circumstances, strengthening our faith, and preparing us for the blessing He has in store. God's timing is also perfect because it is tied to His eternal perspective. In the unity of secrecy, we see things from a limited earthly view, but God sees everything from an eternal viewpoint. He knows how everything fits together, and He understands the bigger picture that we cannot always perceive. He knows the right moment for everything to fall into place, even if it doesn't seem to make sense to us in the moment. When we trust in His timing, we trust in His wisdom. We trust that He sees the full scope of our lives and that He is working all things together for our good, even when it doesn't feel like it. God's timing is not just about when things happen, but also about how things happen. There are times when we may think that the best solution to a problem is the quickest one, but God often works in ways that are more profound and far-reaching than we can understand. The process of waiting, of trusting in His perfect timing, often leads to a deeper relationship with Him. It allows us to grow in patience, faith, and dependence on His provision. Sometimes the waiting period is just as important as the answer we seek because it shapes our character and prepares us for what God has in store. When we learn to trust God's timing, we experience a peace that transcends our understanding. Instead of being anxious or frustrated by delays, we can rest in the confidence that God is in control. We can be assured that He is working behind the scenes, even when we don't see immediate results. Trusting in God's timing means we can stop striving, stop forcing things to happen, and stop worrying about the future. We can rest in the knowledge that He knows what is best and that His plan for our lives is always good. As we wait for God's perfect timing, we must remember that it is not a matter of if, but when. He has promised that he will fulfill his word and he will bring his plans to fruition at the perfect moment. In the waiting, we can find peace, knowing that God is faithful and that his timing is always for our benefit. Whether we are waiting for a breakthrough, a healing, or a change in circumstances, we can trust that when the time is right, God will move in ways that are beyond our imagination. His timing is not delayed. It is always perfect. It is easy to become discouraged when we feel that we are fighting alone, when we face overwhelming obstacles and no immediate solution seems to appear. Often, when life feels like an uphill battle, our first instinct is to doubt. We begin to question our purpose, our strength, and even God's presence in our lives. We may wonder why we are going through this trial, why we are enduring hardship, while others seem to have it easier. But it is during these moments, especially when we are at our weakest, that God's strength is most evident. God promises us that he will fight for us when we can no longer fight for ourselves. Throughout the Bible, God continually reminds his people that he is not distant or indifferent to their struggles. He is actively involved in their battles, fighting on their behalf. In the book of Exodus, God speaks to the Israelites as they stand on the edge of the Red Sea, with Pharaoh's army closing in on them. The Israelites were terrified, feeling trapped and helpless, but God reassured them by saying, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." At that moment, God instructed them not to try to fight the battle themselves, but to trust him to do what they could not. The Lord went on to part the Red Sea, leading his people to safety and defeating their enemies. This was not the result of any action or strategy from the Israelites. It was the result of God's intervention. This story illustrates a powerful truth. There are moments in life when we simply cannot fight on our own. We face circumstances that are too big for us, challenges that are beyond our abilities, and we find ourselves exhausted from the struggle. It is in these moments that God steps in to fight for us. We are not called to carry the weight of the battle ourselves, but to surrender it to God. When we choose to trust in his strength, we make room for his power to move in ways we cannot even imagine. The Apostle Paul wrote about this in 2 Corinthians 12. Where he speaks of his own weakness. He had a thorn in the flesh, something that caused him great pain and frustration. He prayed to God 3 times to remove it, but God responded by saying, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Paul came to understand that in his weakness, God's strength was magnified. It was not through his own efforts that victory would come, but through God's power working in him. In fact, Paul boasted about his weaknesses, knowing that it was in these very areas that God's power would be most clearly seen. When we face battles, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual, we must remember that we are not alone. God is with us in the fight, and he is our ultimate source of strength. He does not expect us to fight alone or to handle everything on our own. In fact, he calls us to rely on him completely. The psalmist wrote, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" These words remind us that God is not just an observer of our struggles. He is our protector, our defender, and our strength. When we are weak, he is strong. When we are weary, he is our rest. God's strength is not like human strength. It is not limited by time, space, or circumstance. His power is perfect and all-encompassing. His ability to fight on our behalf is not confined by our understanding of how battles should be fought. God doesn't need to follow our strategies or timelines. He knows exactly what needs to be done and how to do it. The power of God is evident in the way he fights for us, often in ways that surprise us, in ways that we could never have imagined. The victory that God brings is not simply the absence of struggle, but the manifestation of his strength in the midst of our weakness. God's fight for us is not just about delivering us from external challenges. It is also about transforming us internally. God's battles are not just about overcoming circumstances. They are about shaping us, refining us, and making us more like him. When God fights for us, he often uses the struggle as a tool for growth. The process of going through difficult times with God at our side builds our faith, deepens our character, and helps us to rely on him more fully. It is through these trials that we learn to trust in God's ability to fight for us and deliver us from the forces that come against us. God is fighting on our behalf, not just for our own good, but for his glory. His victory in our lives is a testimony to his greatness. When others see how God has fought for us and brought us through challenges, it points them to the power and faithfulness of God. Our battles become a reflection of his glory and a demonstration of his strength. As we face battles in life, we must remember that we are not fighting in our own strength. We are fighting with God on our side. Our responsibility is not to try to control the outcome or fight the battle ourselves, but to trust in God's strength and his ability to win the victory for us. When we surrender our battles to God, we make way for his power to be displayed in ways that we could never achieve on our own. He will fight for us, and in his strength, we will overcome. In every battle, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual, there comes a point where we must relinquish control and trust in God's ultimate plan for our lives. Our natural tendency is to take charge, to strategize, and to ensure that everything is done according to our will. However, this desire to control often leads to frustration, burnout, and a sense of isolation. God, in his wisdom, reminds us that there is power in surrender. Surrender to his will, his plan, and his way. It is in this act of surrender that we find true strength, peace, and victory. One of the clearest examples of this principle in the Bible is found in the life of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Just hours before his crucifixion, Jesus, in his humanity, was overwhelmed with sorrow. He knew what awaited him, the pain, the suffering, the separation from God. He asked the Father if there was any way the cup of suffering could pass from him, but he ultimately surrendered his will with these powerful words, "Not my will, but yours be done." Jesus, in his most vulnerable moment, chose to lay down his control and trust that God's plan, though it seemed unbearable, was the path to ultimate victory. This act of surrender was not a sign of weakness. It was an act of strength. Jesus understood that his mission was greater than his own desires or comfort. In surrendering his will, he positioned himself to fulfill his purpose, knowing that God's plan was for the greater good of humanity. The victory of the cross came not through fighting, but through submission. Jesus knew that only by surrendering to God's will could he accomplish the mission he had been sent to complete. In the same way, when we are faced with battles, our first instinct might be to fight, to make plans, and to try to manipulate circumstances in our favor. However, true victory comes when we let go of our need for control and yield to God's leading. The process of surrendering is not passive, it is active obedience. It requires us to trust God with what we cannot see, to believe that his plans are better than our own, and to acknowledge that His timing and methods are perfect. In surrender, we often discover that we are not as in control as we thought. Life has a way of throwing curveballs, and when we rely solely on our own understanding and strength, we quickly find ourselves overwhelmed. But when we surrender, we release the pressure of having to have all the answers. We let go of the need to control every outcome and trust that God is working things together for our good. This act of letting go is not about giving up, but about giving it to God. About recognizing that He is the one who holds the power to change situations, heal hearts, and bring about the best possible outcome. Surrendering also means letting go of our personal agendas and desires. We often come to God with a specific request or a vision of how we want things to turn out. But God's perspective is higher than ours. He sees the bigger picture, the one we cannot fully comprehend. Sometimes His answers to our prayers are not what we expect or desire, but they are always what we need. When we choose to surrender, we are acknowledging that God's way is best, even when it doesn't make sense in the moment. It is a declaration of faith that we trust God to work in ways that are beyond our understanding, and that we believe He knows what is best for us. In the Bible, we see numerous examples of individuals who found victory through surrender. One such example is the story of King Jehoshaphat in 2 Chronicles 20. When faced with a vast army that was set to destroy Judah, Jehoshaphat was afraid. He called on the people of Judah to fast and pray, seeking God's intervention. In response, God spoke through a prophet, telling them that the battle was not theirs to fight, but God's. He instructed them to stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord. Jehoshaphat, in faith, led his people to surrender the battle to God. Instead of preparing for war, they worshiped. As they praised God, He caused their enemies to turn on each other, and the victory was theirs without ever having to lift a sword. This victory was not won by human strength, strategy, or control, but by surrendering to God's will and trusting Him to fight the battle. The act of surrendering to God is also an invitation to experience peace in the midst of chaos. When we hold on to control, we are often filled with anxiety and fear. The pressure of trying to manage every detail can be overwhelming, but when we surrender, we give up the burden of having to control everything. We trust that God is in control, and this trust brings peace. Jesus Himself said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." This is the rest that comes from surrendering our struggles to Him, from trusting that He will fight for us, and that His plans for our lives are good. Surrender also means releasing our desire for instant results. We live in a world that demands quick solutions and immediate gratification. We expect answers to come fast and problems to be solved in an instant. But God's ways are often different. His timing does not align with our expectations. When we surrender, we acknowledge that God's timing is perfect, even when it doesn't match our own. We may have to wait, we may have to endure, but the process of waiting is part of what God uses to shape us. It is in these moments that our faith is refined and our dependence on God grows stronger. In surrendering to God, we are not passive in the face of our struggles. Rather, we are choosing to actively place our trust in Him. We acknowledge that the victory will come not through our own strength or ability, but through His power and provision. The process of surrender is an ongoing one that requires constant trust, obedience, and faith. Yet it is in surrender that we find the true freedom to experience God's peace, His strength, and His victory in every area of our lives. When we let go of the need to control, We open ourselves up to the miraculous ways in which God moves on our behalf. Surrender, then, is not an act of weakness, but an act of faith that releases God's power to work in and through us. When we face trials and tribulations, our natural response is often to look for ways to protect ourselves. We seek shelter from the storm, we build walls to guard our hearts, and we try to shield ourselves from pain and disappointment. But the truth is, no matter how much we try to control the circumstances, life is unpredictable, and challenges are inevitable. The battle is not always against external forces, but sometimes against our own fear, doubt, and lack of trust. It is in these moments when we feel the weight of the battle that we must remember that God is our refuge, our strength, and our deliverer. God's promise to fight our battles does not come with conditions. He does not require us to be strong or to have it all together. He does not need us to prove our worth or our ability to fight for ourselves. In fact, the Bible repeatedly reminds us that when we are weak, He is strong. His power is made perfect in our weakness, and it is in our vulnerability that He can truly work. This is where our trust in God becomes vital. We must trust that no matter how impossible the situation seems, God is able to fight the battle on our behalf, and that He will always do so with our best interest in mind. Throughout Scripture, we see countless examples of God's faithfulness to fight for His people. When the Israelites were trapped between the Red Sea and the advancing Egyptian army, they were terrified. They had no way out, no means of escape. It seemed like the end. But God, in His mercy, parted the Red Sea, making a way where there seemed to be none. He fought for them when they could do nothing but stand and watch. This moment serves as a powerful reminder that we are not alone in our struggles. Even when we cannot see the way forward, God is already working behind the scenes to bring about deliverance. Similarly, in the book of 2 Chronicles, King Jehoshaphat faced a vast army coming against him. In his fear and uncertainty, he turned to God in prayer. He acknowledged that he had no strength to face such an overwhelming enemy, but he also acknowledged that God was the only one who could deliver them. God responded through a prophet, saying that the battle was not theirs to fight, but his. Jehoshaphat, in an act of faith, led the people of Judah to trust in God's promise and to praise Him even before the victory came. As they worshiped, God caused their enemies to turn on each other, and the victory was won without them lifting a sword. These stories are not just historical accounts, but they are reminders for us today that God is still fighting for His people. When we surrender our battles to Him, we give Him the space to work in ways that we could never accomplish on our own. We may not always see how He is working, and we may not always understand His timing, but we can be certain that He is faithful to fulfill His promises. The key to experiencing God's victory in our battles is learning to let go of control and trust in His plan. The Bible tells us to cast all our anxieties on God because He cares for us. In doing so, we acknowledge that we cannot handle everything on our own, and we invite God to take the lead. The act of surrender is not about passivity, but about actively choosing to trust God and His power to work on our behalf. When we choose to trust God, we release the burden of trying to figure everything out, and we allow Him to fight for us. This trust requires us to believe that God's plan is better than our own. Our understanding of the situation may be limited, and our desire for a specific outcome may cloud our judgment, but God's wisdom far exceeds our own, and His ways are always higher than ours. Trusting in His plan means believing that, even when things don't go as we expect, He is still in control, and He is working all things together for our good. Even in the most difficult moments, we can take comfort in the fact that God is with us, fighting on our behalf and working out his purpose in our lives. The battle is not ours to fight alone. God promises to fight with us and for us. He is not a distant observer, but an active participant in our struggles. When we are weary and overwhelmed, we can find rest in knowing that God is our strength. We do not have to carry the weight of the battle on our own shoulders. God's power is greater than anything we can face, and his love for us is greater than any fear or obstacle. In every circumstance, God is with us, and he will never leave us or forsake us. God's promise to fight for us is not just about the big battles, but also about the smaller, everyday struggles that we face, whether it's a challenge at work, a difficult relationship, or an internal battle with doubt or fear. God is fighting for us in all areas of our lives. We can take comfort in knowing that no battle is too small or insignificant for God. He cares about every detail of our lives and is always working on our behalf. In the end, the victory that God gives us is not just about overcoming our external struggles, but about transforming us in the process. As we trust in his power and surrender to his will, we are changed. Our faith is strengthened, our character is refined, and our dependence on God grows deep. The ultimate victory is not just in the outcome, but in the transformation that occurs when we allow God to fight our battles for us. When we step back and let him take control, we discover that his plans are greater than anything we could have imagined, and his victory is sweeter than anything we could have achieved on our own. In conclusion, when we face battles in life, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual, we are reminded that we do not have to fight alone. God promises to fight for us and with us, and the victory is not achieved through our own strength or efforts, but through our surrender to his will and trust in his timing. Just as he fought for the Israelites, King Jehoshaphat, and countless others in the Bible, he is fighting for us today. By letting go of our need for control and placing our battles in his hands, we open ourselves to experience his power, his peace, and his provision in ways we could never accomplish on our own. In trusting God to fight for us, we not only see the victory in our circumstances, but we also experience personal transformation, growing in faith, resilience, and dependence on him. Remember, God is always at work on our behalf, and when we surrender our struggles to him, we position ourselves to walk in his victory, his peace, and his purpose.